There is a version of Michael Jordan that the world decided to believe. Clean sneakers, perfect smile, 6 rings. The logo, that black silhouette, arms out, suspended in a place where gravity didn't apply. That version is real. It happened. Every number, every title, every moment of impossible brilliance is documented and undeniable. But that version is also incomplete, and the part that got left out is not a footnote. It is the engine. Here is what you need to know before any of it makes sense. Michael Jordan did not become the greatest basketball player who ever lived despite the disrespect he faced. He became who he was because of it. Every slight, every dismissal, every moment when someone looked at him and decided he wasn't enough, he catalogued all of it. He held onto it the way other people hold onto photographs. He took it with him into every gym, every practice, every game that ever mattered. And 30 years later, when he stood on the stage at the Basketball Hall of Fame with tears on his face and 6 championship rings to his name, the first thing out of his mouth was not a thank you. It was a list of everyone who had ever told him no. This is that story, not the statue version, the real one. It begins in Wilmington, North Carolina, a city that carries more history in its soil than most Americans are taught. In 1898, a white supremacist mob had torn through the city and overthrown its elected black government in an act of political violence that would not be fully acknowledged or discussed for nearly a century. That history didn't vanish. It calcified. It lived in the way institutions worked and the way certain looks were given across certain rooms, and the way a black boy in the 1970s learned very early exactly how much space he was permitted to occupy. Michael Jeffrey Jordan was born in Brooklyn in 1963 and raised in Wilmington from the age of 2. His father, James, worked at a General Electric plant. His mother, Dolores, was a bank teller with a will of iron and a clarity of purpose that Michael would later say was the most important force in his development. They were not wealthy. They were not connected. They were a family that believed in work and in dignity, and in the ancient stubborn faith that effort eventually speaks louder than circumstance. Michael was not, by his own admission, a remarkable child. His older brother Larry was the standout, smaller than Michael, but ferocious on the backyard court behind their house, the kind of player who won by wanting it more than the other person, which is exactly the kind of competitor that sharpens everyone around him. Michael and Larry fought constantly on that dirt court. Michael lost and lost and lost again, and came back the next day, and the day after that, because losing to Larry felt like losing to something he wasn't supposed to lose to, and that feeling was something he discovered very early could be converted into something useful. But the first disrespect that truly cracked him open didn't come from a basketball court. It came in a classroom in 1977 when Michael was in 9th grade at Laney High School in Wilmington. He was 14 years old. A white girl in his class said something to his face, not in a whisper, not as a secret, that no one was meant to say to another human being. She used the worst word in the American language, the one that carries 400 years of systematic dehumanization inside its 2 syllables, and she said it the way people say things they learned at home and never thought to question. Michael threw a soda at her. He was suspended from school. When Dolores Jordan came to pick him up, she did not do what he might have expected. She did not rush to comfort him. She sat him down and told him something in the plain, steady way she delivered all truths that mattered. Don't let their hatred turn you into something you're not. Don't shrink. Don't become what they want you to be when they treat you like that. Don't give them the satisfaction of making you smaller. Years later, Michael would tell the biographer Roland Lazenby something remarkable about that period of his life. He said that in those years, he considered himself a racist. He said he was against all white people. He was 14 years old, in a state where the KKK had once been stronger than anywhere else in the country, carrying a humiliation so complete that it had temporarily curdled into something hard and closed. But here is the thing his mother understood, the thing she had tried to give him before he was old enough to use it properly. That kind of pain, turned inward, destroys you. Turned outward, as rage, it destroys others. But transformed, redirected into the grinding, relentless daily discipline of becoming the best version of yourself possible, it becomes fuel that never runs out. Michael Jordan had just found his fuel. He didn't know it yet. The next part of the story would make it clear. A year after the classroom incident, Michael walked into the gymnasium at Laney High School as a 15-year-old sophomore and joined the crowd of boys trying out for the varsity basketball team. He was 5 feet 10 inches tall. He could not yet dunk. He was quick, competitive, harder working than almost anyone in that gym, but he was also a sophomore, which in the coded mathematics of high school athletics meant that the deck was already partially stacked against him. Coach Clifton "Pop" Herring watched the tryouts. He had a team to build. He needed height. And there, among the boys competing for those 15 roster spots, was a 6'7" sophomore named Leroy Smith, Michael's own friend. Height was currency in that gym, and Leroy had it. The last spot on the varsity roster went to Leroy Smith. Michael Jordan walked to the locker room. He found the list taped to the coach's door. He scanned the names in alphabetical order. He looked for Jay. He didn't find it. He looked again. He sat through the rest of the school day in a state he would later describe as numbness, walking from class to class, sitting in his seat, doing the mechanical things a person does when the larger part of their mind has gone somewhere else entirely. He waited until he got home. He went to his room. He closed the door. He cried. Nobody knew yet what that moment would cost them. The door stayed closed for a long time. That is the detail that matters most. Not the crying. Crying is human, ordinary, allowed. What matters is what happened on the other side of it. When Michael Jordan finally opened that door, he was not the same person who had closed it. Something had been decided in that room in the dark. In the company of a hurt so specific, it had a name and a face and a height of 6 feet 7 inches. He was going to make everyone who had missed him pay for it with their attention. He was going to become so undeniable that the word no would eventually be physically incapable of finding him. That summer, Michael Jordan grew, not metaphorically, biologically. He went from 5 feet 10 to 6 feet 3 in what seemed to the people around him like a matter of weeks. But it was the invisible growth that was more significant. He worked on his game with a focus that alarmed even people who had seen dedicated athletes before. He woke early. He stayed late. He practiced moves until they stopped being things he was trying to do and became things his body simply did, automatic and unstoppable. Coach Herring, watching from a distance, understood what was happening. He would say later that he had never coached anyone who converted rejection into work the way Michael Jordan did. By his junior year, there was no list to check. Michael Jordan was the varsity team. He averaged 20 points per game. His senior year, he was a McDonald's All-American, one of the most coveted designations in high school basketball, reserved for the players so exceptional they warranted national attention before they had played a single college game. The North Carolina papers started writing about him. Recruiting letters arrived at the Jordan home. And through all of it, Michael kept the name Leroy Smith somewhere in the back of his mind, not as an enemy but as a reminder that the list had been wrong and that being right about it was not enough. You had to show it. He chose the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill, where Dean Smith had been building one of the most respected basketball programs in the country since 1961. Smith was a man of principle in an era when principled men in college coaching were rarer than they should have been. He had recruited the first black scholarship basketball player in North Carolina's Atlantic Coast Conference, Charlie Scott, back in 1966, when that decision required a kind of courage that the people who benefited from it rarely acknowledged. He understood young black men from the South with chips on their shoulders because he had spent 20 years watching them walk through his door, and he had developed a specific wisdom about what to do with that energy and what to do with the egos that sometimes came attached to it. What Smith saw in Michael Jordan was not just talent. Talent was common enough at that level. What Smith saw was something rarer, a young man whose hunger was structural. It wasn't situational, wasn't something that spiked before big games and quieted in the in-between times. It was constant. It was almost metabolic. Smith recognized that this kind of competitor needed to be channeled, not managed. He built an offense that demanded unselfishness. Everyone fed the ball, everyone moved. No individual performance took precedence over the collective result. For a player of Jordan's gifts, this was its own kind of test. Jordan took it. His freshman year 1981, the NCAA championship game in New Orleans, North Carolina versus Georgetown. Georgetown was led by Patrick Ewing, who would go on to have a Hall of Fame career in the NBA and who was, at that moment, the most intimidating presence in college basketball. The game was close, as championship games have a way of being, and with 17 seconds left, North Carolina trailed by 1 point. Dean Smith called a timeout. He drew up a play. And then he did something that would seem, in retrospect, either like supreme confidence or a kind of faith in what he had been watching all year in practice. He called the play for the freshman. The ball found Michael Jordan on the left wing, 16 feet from the basket. There was a Georgetown defender between him and the shot. Jordan took one dribble, set his feet, and released the ball. It went in. North Carolina won the national championship. Michael Jordan was not yet 19 years old. He stood on the court afterward while confetti fell and his teammates celebrated around him, and somewhere in the back of his mind, one more name was crossed off a list. The coaches who had overlooked him, the girl in the classroom, the coach's door with someone else's name on it. He was keeping score. He would keep score for the rest of his life. In 1984, Jordan left UNC after his junior year, led the United States Olympic team to a gold medal in Los Angeles, and entered the NBA draft. The Chicago Bulls selected him third overall, after Houston took Hakeem Olajuwon and Portland, famously and disastrously, took center Sam Bowie, a decision that would haunt Portland's franchise and follow Bowie for his entire career. Jordan arrived in Chicago as a 21-year-old from Wilmington, from a place built on the memory of violence and the daily practice of surviving it, carrying the specific fire of a person who had been told no more times than most prodigies get told, and who had answered each no with something that made the no look small. What he found in Chicago was not what anyone had promised him. The locker room was, by multiple accounts, a mess. Several veterans had serious drug problems. The culture was undisciplined, unfocused, the kind of environment that swallows young players who don't have a clear internal compass. Jordan had a compass. He also had, for the first time in his life, a city watching him that had no idea yet what he was, and owners and executives who thought they did. Jerry Reinsdorf had bought the Bulls that same year. Jerry Krause was in the front office assembling a roster. The coaches would rotate: Kevin Loughery for that first season, Stan Albeck the next, then Doug Collins. The organization was in flux, and Jordan, still 21 years old in his first professional camp, discovered quickly that being the most talented person in the room was not the same as having power. In the world he had just entered, power was distributed by people who sat in offices and wore suits, and they had their own ideas about who Michael Jordan was allowed to be. What they hadn't calculated was what was still in the back of his mind. Leroy Smith's name on a list, a classroom in Wilmington, a door he had cried behind. He hadn't brought any of it to Chicago to leave it behind. He had brought it because, as he was already learning at 21 in this world and at this level, there was always going to be another list. Always another room where someone decided who was good enough. And the only answer that had ever worked was the same one it had been since he was 15. Show them. His first regular season NBA game was October 26, 1984, against the Washington Bullets. He scored 16 points, modest by his standards, the standards he had already set for himself, which were not the same as anyone else's. But then something started happening that Chicago had not prepared for, and the rest of the league had not anticipated. The numbers began to accumulate in a way that defied the normal curve of a rookie, adjusting to the pace and physicality of professional basketball. 28 points per game on the season, 51% shooting from the field, steals in the top 5 in the league. The Bulls improved from 27 wins to 38, which was 11 more games won, which in professional basketball represents an enormous shift, a shift that can usually only be attributed to a single variable. The variable had a name and it wore number 23. But here is where the story begins to develop a shadow, because even as Jordan was dismantling opposing teams with a combination of athleticism and intelligence that announcers kept running out of words for, there was a disrespect happening at the organizational level that was quieter and therefore more corrosive than any outright insult. The Bulls' management for the first full season treated Jordan as something they had lucked into, a spectacular asset to be preserved and leveraged, rather than as a player to be built around and trusted. The tension was subtle at first. Then came his second year and the foot. In the third game of the 1985-86 season, Jordan broke a bone in his left foot. He would miss 64 games. The injury itself was devastating for a player who had arrived in Chicago with such momentum, but what followed the injury was in many ways more instructive. Jordan wanted to return. His foot healed. He felt ready. He kept feeling ready, kept telling the medical staff and the coaching staff that he was ready, kept asking to play. The organization said no, not because they didn't believe him, because they were doing the calculation of a team that had a losing record and believed that their best path to the #1 draft pick the following year ran through continued losing. In other words, they needed to lose. And Jordan, healthy and furious on the bench, was not useful to that plan. He understood exactly what was happening. He was 22 years old. He had grown up in Wilmington, had survived every form of institutional disrespect that city and that era could produce, and now the franchise he played for was asking him to lose on purpose. Not out of malice, but out of the cold, impersonal logic of a business decision that treated his burning to compete as an inconvenient variable. He would say later that this was one of the most painful experiences of his early career. Not the broken foot, the sitting. He fought them, not loudly, not in the way that ends careers and gets players traded and creates enemies in front offices. He fought them the way he fought every obstacle, persistently, internally, until the opposition wore down. He came back with enough season remaining to make the playoffs, and then something happened in the first round that settled the question of what Michael Jordan was, once and for all, for anyone who had been slow to understand it. The Chicago Bulls in the 1986 playoffs faced the Boston Celtics, who that year went 67-15 in the regular season and were widely considered one of the greatest teams in the history of the sport. Larry Bird, Kevin McHale, Robert Parrish, Dennis Johnson, a roster of Hall of Famers operating at the peak of their collective intelligence, a machine built for winning that had already accumulated multiple championships and showed no signs of slowing. The Bulls were not expected to survive the series. Most analysts thought the question wasn't whether Chicago would lose, but how quickly. In Game 1, Jordan scored 49 points. The Celtics won the game. The talent disparity across the roster was too large for one player to fully bridge, but the number was staggering. And then came Game 2, April 20th, 1986, at the Boston Garden, one of the most storied buildings in American sports, filled with a crowd that had watched greatness so often they claimed to know it on sight. Jordan played 63 minutes, which was possible only because the game went to double overtime, and he scored 63 points. 63. Without a single three-pointer, against the greatest defensive team in basketball, against 4 future Hall of Famers who knew exactly what he was going to do before he did it, and couldn't stop him anyway. Larry Bird said afterward, in the quiet way that Bird made the most memorable statements, that it was God disguised as Michael Jordan. He meant it entirely as a compliment. The Celtics swept the series, as expected, as the roster difference demanded. But what happened at the Boston Garden on April 20th, 1986, was not a defeat. It was an announcement. The rest of the league received it. And here is where the plot twist enters the story, because the person who almost made sure that night never happened was not an opposing player or a racist classmate or a coach with a list. It was the management of the Chicago Bulls. Doug Collins, who took over as head coach in the 1986-87 season, would later say with honest regret that he wished he had known earlier how good Jordan was going to be. He admitted, with the candor of a man who had made peace with his mistakes, that he mishandled the early chapters of Jordan's greatness. The 1986-87 season was the year Jordan became only the second player in NBA history, after Wilt Chamberlain, to score 3,000 points in a single season, averaging 37.1 points per game across a stretch of games that defied any rational framework for what a single player could do. He led the league in scoring. He was in the top 5 in steals and minutes. By every measure available, he was the most remarkable individual performer the NBA had ever produced. And the Bulls were losing. Because Jordan alone, Jordan playing the most extraordinary basketball a single player had played since Chamberlain, was still not enough to drag a roster that had almost no one else to contribute into genuine playoff contention. The question of whether management was doing enough to build around him was one that Jordan held carefully, the way he held all his grievances, close, private, converting slowly from frustration into the kind of cold, sustained motivation that doesn't announce itself but shows up every single morning in the gym before anyone else gets there. He was not going to wait. He was not going to be patient in the way that organizations ask their best players to be patient when they mean accept things as they are. He had learned at 15, in the year after the list on the coach's door, exactly what the appropriate response to that kind of patience was. He had learned that the list changes when you make it impossible to ignore. There is a year in Michael Jordan's career that gets talked about less than it should. A year that is not the championships year, and not the flu game year, and not the year of the shot, but that contains perhaps more information about who Michael Jordan truly was than any of the highlight moments. That year is 1985, and the information it contains has to do with race, and with the peculiar position that Jordan was discovering himself in, a position that no amount of talent or preparation had fully equipped him to navigate. The Air Jordan shoe had launched in the fall of 1984. The numbers were, by the standards of the industry, so extraordinary that Nike's own executives had trouble processing them. In the first year alone, Air Jordan generated $126 million in sales. The shoes were everywhere, on feet, on playgrounds, in the conversations of young people who had never watched an NBA game but understood instinctively that something different was happening with this particular sneaker. The phenomenon was real, and underneath it something else was also happening. Michael Jordan had signed with Nike partly because Adidas didn't want him. The people at Adidas had looked at the young man from Wilmington and decided he wasn't the right image for their brand. He wasn't tall enough. He didn't project what they were looking for. They passed. Converse had offered $100,000 and a supporting role in their existing narrative of Bird and Magic. Nike had offered $2.5 million over 5 years, and crucially because of the insistence of Jordan and his agent David Falk and his mother Dolores, a royalty structure that would eventually produce a wealth no one in any of those rooms had imagined possible. Nike thought the royalties were a minor concession, a goodwill gesture. They were actually the mechanism by which Michael Jordan would eventually become a billionaire. But in 1985, in the immediate aftermath of the launch, what Jordan was experiencing inside the league had very little to do with wealth. It had to do with something more immediate and more uncomfortable. He was a black man who had become, almost overnight, the most commercially valuable athlete in a sport that was majority black, for a company that was entirely white at its executive level, selling a fantasy of individual achievement and freedom to a country that was having a very specific and very unresolved conversation about race. The Reagan years, the crack epidemic hitting black communities with the force of a targeting weapon. Cities burning, quietly, from within. And on television, a young man from Wilmington, North Carolina was flying, and everyone was invited to watch him fly, and the price of admission was not thinking too hard about anything beyond the flight. Jordan understood this even then. He was 22 years old and he was not naive, could not afford to be, had not been allowed to be, had grown up in a city that taught you the cost of naivety before you were old enough to choose otherwise. He understood what was being asked of him when the marketing executives told him to keep things light, keep things fun, keep things universal. He understood that universal in the America of 1985 meant don't make white people uncomfortable. Don't remind anyone that you came from somewhere. Just fly. And here is where the story produces its most difficult question. Was Jordan wrong to play along? Because he did, broadly, play along. He was charming in the commercials. He was not political. He did not use his growing platform to speak on the issues that were tearing through the black communities, that were buying his shoes in disproportionate numbers, sometimes, heartbreakingly, spending money they didn't have to own a piece of the image that was being sold back to them as aspiration. Critics noticed. They would continue to notice and would eventually say so loudly for years to come. But in 1985, Jordan was still finding his footing in a system that had very clear rules about what happened to black athletes who stepped outside the lane they'd been assigned. He had watched it happen. Muhammad Ali, who had refused induction into the military in 1967 on religious and moral grounds, had been stripped of his heavyweight title and prosecuted by the United States government, losing 4 years of his athletic prime to the consequences of speaking his conscience in a country that was not prepared to hear it. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar had spoken on race and politics throughout his career and had been treated by much of the white sports media as difficult, as polarizing, as a problem to be managed rather than a human being to be engaged. The tax on black excellence that came attached to black opinion was well documented, well understood, and very real. Jordan was paying attention. What he was also doing, and what the critics who focused on his silence tended to underemphasize, was building. Every day that he went to practice and elevated his game another fraction of a degree, every season that added another layer to his legend, every endorsement deal that generated royalties, not salary, ownership, not performance. He was building towards something that could not be taken away from him, the way titles and platforms and public goodwill can be taken away from men who speak too soon, who speak before they have the power to back up what they say. What stood between him and championships was Detroit, the bad boy Pistons, and the specific disrespect they had constructed for him with the cold precision of engineers. The Detroit Pistons, under coach Chuck Daly, had developed what they called the Jordan Rules, a defensive scheme designed specifically for Michael Jordan, a set of instructions for how to stop him, or more accurately, how to make being stopped cost him so much physical punishment that the stopping and the hurting became the same thing. Double-team him the moment he touched the ball. Allow no easy path to the basket. If he was going to score, make him earn every single point with his body. If he drove the lane, he would be met with forearms and hips and the specific aggression of Dennis Rodman and Bill Laimbeer and Rick Mahorn, players who had decided that the rules of the sport were a ceiling, and they intended to operate right below that ceiling with maximum discomfort for anyone who came through the paint. The Jordan Rules were not just a basketball strategy, they were a statement. They said, "We see you, we know what you are, and we have decided collectively that the answer to what you are is pain." Year after year, the Pistons stopped the Bulls in the playoffs. Year after year, Jordan collected the bruises and the losses, and the frustrated awareness that no matter how extraordinary he was individually, the team around him was not yet capable of absorbing the load he couldn't carry alone. 3 years in a row, 1988, 1989, 1990, the Pistons ended Chicago's season. And through all of it, Jordan did not break. He adapted. He studied Detroit the way a general studies an opponent's terrain. He pushed the organization to acquire the pieces that could help him. He pushed himself harder, in ways that his teammates sometimes found almost frightening in their intensity. There are stories from that era of practice sessions so ferocious that veterans who had played in the league for a decade came off the floor shaking their heads. Jordan punched Steve Kerr in the eye during a practice scrimmage, not in malice, but in the absolute refusal to practice at any level below the level of the thing he was preparing for. He was not preparing to play basketball. He was preparing to be undeniable. And then finally, in 1991, Phil Jackson arrived at full authority, and Scottie Pippen arrived at his full capability, and the Bulls went through the Pistons and through the Lakers and won the first championship. Jordan fell to his knees on the court afterward and wept. It was not a performance. It was the specific relief of a man who had been converting every loss and every disrespect and every Jordan rule and every "you're not good enough" into something he had been carrying for years and who had finally been allowed to put it down. But the story wasn't finished. There was still something waiting. September 11, 2009, Springfield, Massachusetts, the Basketball Hall of Fame induction ceremony. The room was full of greatness, coaches, former players, family members, the accumulated legacy of the sport displayed in 3 dimensions. 12,000 people had gathered to celebrate the greatest player who had ever lived, to give him his formal and permanent place in the architecture of the game. Jordan walked to the microphone. He was 46 years old, with 6 rings and an Olympic gold medal, and Jordan Brand generating more revenue annually than he had earned in his entire playing career combined. He stood at that microphone, with the whole world watching, and the first thing he did was reach into the back of his mind and pull out the list. He mentioned Leroy Smith. He had invited Leroy Smith to the ceremony. He looked at him in the audience and told the room, told 12,000 people and everyone watching at home, that Leroy had made the varsity team and he hadn't, and that he had been motivated by that for 30 years. He mentioned Coach Pop Herring. He mentioned his college teammate Buzz Peterson, who had been named the state's high school player of the year over Jordan in a vote that Jordan considered incorrect. He looked at the players who had played against him, who had tried to stop him, and found specific ways to remind them that they hadn't. He cried. The crying Jordan meme was born in that moment, his face caught mid-sob, which the internet would later attach to every humiliation and defeat in sports culture because of its perfect specificity. It was the face of a person feeling something enormous, and the internet recognized something universal in it, something human and exposed and unexpectedly real. The speech made some people uncomfortable. Some said Jordan had been punitive and petty, that he had used the most celebratory moment of his career to relitigate old scores. Others simply didn't understand why a man with 6 championships still needed Leroy Smith's name on a list in his head. But they were misreading the speech, or rather, they were reading it correctly and reaching the wrong conclusion. The speech was not a failure of perspective. It was the most honest thing Michael Jordan had ever said in public. It was a confession about the mechanism, about the specific internal architecture that had produced everything they had gathered to celebrate. The speech was Jordan pulling back the curtain on where the rings actually came from. Not from talent, not from God-given gifts, not from the kind of natural excellence that arrives fully formed and requires only expression. The rings came from the list. The rings came from the girl in the classroom in 1977, from the coach's door in 1978, from 64 games on the bench in 1985, from 3 years of Detroit's forearms in the paint, from every single no and every single doubt and every single moment when the world decided he wasn't quite enough and he had decided quietly to prove the world wrong. What the critics who found the speech petty were really objecting to was the honesty. We prefer our greatness laundered. We prefer the version where the extraordinary person was always gracious, always above it, always smiling while transcending. The 6-ring version, the logo version, the version where the hurt is invisible and the excellence is clean and nobody had to carry anything to get there. Michael Jordan refused to give them that version, not because he was bitter, because he was telling the truth about what it actually cost. Now think about what that truth means if you are not Michael Jordan. If you are a person who has never had 63-point nights to point to, never had championships to validate the carrying. Think about what it means for anyone who has been told no, for reasons of race or class or gender, or the specific smallness of people who feel safer when others stay small. Jordan's story, at its deepest level, is not about basketball. It is about the conversion of disrespect into purpose. It is about the refusal to let someone else's definition of your value become your definition of your value. It is about understanding that the people who say you're not on the list are not oracles. They are obstacles. And obstacles have a function, which is to show you exactly how badly you want to get to the other side. He never stopped. That is perhaps the most important detail in 30 years of details. He never reached a point where the chip dissolved, where the motivation stopped, where he decided he had proved enough. His net worth is now measured in the billions. Jordan Brand generates over $2 billion annually. He has funded the National Museum of African American History and Culture. He donated $2 million to community police relations organizations in 2016, when he broke a long public silence on racial issues to say, in words this time, what he had been saying with everything else for his entire career, that the world is not the way it should be, and that the way you change the rooms you couldn't once enter is by building the kind of power that eventually makes the doors irrelevant. In 2009 at the Hall of Fame, he said something simple that contained everything. Limits, like fears, are often just an illusion. He said it in a room where he had already proven it. He had been proving it since 1977, in a classroom in Wilmington, when a girl said the worst thing one person can say to another, and a 14-year-old boy chose, in the end, after the soda and the suspension and the crying and the fury and the long work of his mother's wisdom taking root, to answer it with his life. That is what changing everything looks like, not a speech, a life. 30 years of it, point by point, no by no, list by list, until the evidence was so overwhelming that doubt became structurally impossible. Until the logo was everywhere and the name was permanent, and the boy from Wilmington had become, beyond all argument and above all reduction, exactly what he had decided to be in his room with the door closed, in the dark, the year they left his name off the list. If this story hit something in you, if you recognized something of yourself in any part of it, share it with someone who needs to hear it right now. And come back, because the stories we tell on this channel are the ones that live underneath the highlight reels, the ones that explain why the highlights were possible in the first place. Subscribe if you're here for the real story of what greatness actually costs.